big question is, in return, what Putin is willing to give North Korea besides food and fuel in order to get that ammunition. He needs it to, he cannot win the war in Ukraine without this ammunition. So for the first time in the history of the relationship between these two countries, the North Koreans have the upper hand.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has landed in North Korea and is expected to meet with the country's dictator Kim Jong-un in a sign of the two countries' deepening alignment. The streets of the capital, Pyongyang, were lined with Russian flags and posters of Putin ahead of his arrival, his first to the country since 2000. This week's visit is a rare overseas trip for Putin since he launched the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and a key moment for Kim, who has not hosted another world leader since the COVID-19 pandemic. Victor Cha is former director for Asian affairs at the White House National Security Council. He's senior vice president for Asia and Korean chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Good evening to you, Victor.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. Really pleased you were able to join us this evening. What do you think of the significance of the talks that are due to take place between these two leaders?
Well, I think they're pretty significant. As you said, this is probably Putin's closest ally in the war in Ukraine, in the sense that North Korea was one of the first to recognize Russian gains in eastern Ukraine. They've gone against every UN resolution condemning Putin, and of course now they're supplying critical ammunition to Putin so that he can continue this war.
President Putin, I mean, there aren't that many countries he can actually go to because of the legal proceedings against him from the International Court. What do you think he'll be looking for from North Korea?
Well, I think certainly he's looking for more ammunition. Again, even if Russia is producing at full capacity, for the war they want to prosecute in Ukraine, they still will have a shortage of ammunition. So they do need that from North Korea for the foreseeable future, ballistic missiles as well. And the big question is, in return, what Putin is willing to give North Korea besides food and fuel in order to get that ammunition. He needs it to, he cannot win the war in Ukraine without this ammunition. So for the first time in the history of the relationship between these two countries, the North Koreans have the upper hand.
Yeah, it's fascinating this. The Kremlin is describing the trip as a friendly state visit. And we're hearing there's going to be a big parade in the central square, a concert, and so on, with North Korea essentially rolling out the red carpet for the Russian leader.
Yeah, I think this is, for the North Korean leader, this is the last time we saw him on the international stage is when he had that huge failed summit with Donald Trump in Hanoi in 2019. And then after that, he went into a 3.5-year COVID lockdown. So this was about the best thing that could happen for the North Korean leader to be able to do their version of a state visit, giving all the bells and whistles to Putin. So this is very important for North Korea in terms of recovering from the embarrassment of the Trump summit diplomacy for their domestic audience.
How much do we think that North Korea is really able to provide the Russians with when it comes to the military hardware that Putin wants for the war in Ukraine?
So according to experts that we work with, Russia produces about 250,000 rounds of ammunition a month at full capacity. Yet the war they're prosecuting in Ukraine requires 10,000 rounds a day. So they have clearly a net deficit monthly. And there's only one country they can get that from, and that is North Korea. It's also been the case that the Ukrainians have reported North Korean ballistic missile parts in Ukraine after the attacks by the Russians. So North Korea is providing ballistic missiles, and they're also able to test the accuracy of their ballistic missiles by watching them work on the battlefield in Europe.
Because we've heard suggestions that actually the equipment and the ammunition which North Korea can provide is pretty ancient stuff, somewhat out of date. But in a sense, if you're looking at ballistic missiles, maybe that doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And their ballistic missiles are actually not as bad as some of their old ammunition, the initial ammunition they gave to the Russians. They're actually pretty good ballistic missiles because they've sold them to Iran and Pakistan and others. In terms of the ammunition, the thing to worry about is North Korea has given away all its old stocks to Russia or sold them to Russia. Now they can produce new and better ones, which have an impact not only for Russian stockpiles in the war in Ukraine, but also for the military balance on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia more broadly.
President Putin has taken several of his senior ministers with him. How do you think this sort of visit plays back at home?
For the Russians, I mean, I think, again, as you mentioned, they're completely diplomatically isolated now. And I think from Putin's perspective and his people, this is a very strategic move from their perspective because they are not only using the North Korea relationship to affect the battlefield in Europe, by what Putin potentially can give to North Korea, they're affecting the military balance on the Korean Peninsula. They're affecting broadly the security in the Indo-Pacific, and they're also affecting North Korea's ability to threaten the continental United States with intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the United States very concerned about this meeting, haven't we?
Yes, I mean, I wish the U.S. had expressed more concern earlier from the very first report of sale of munitions to the Wagner Group when they were involved in the war. But it's become much more apparent lately, I think just because the volume is so large. We're talking now about, they've reported over 5 million rounds of ammunition, over 10,000 shipping containers going from North Korea to Russia that are filling three munition stockpiles right on the war front.
And those could, presumably really strengthen Russia's hands at a time that there are real concerns about Russian gains, especially along that eastern front in Ukraine.
Yes, I think that's right. The Russians really do need this ammunition, as I mentioned earlier, and it was coming steadily at a time when U.S. support for Ukraine faltered. I mean, eventually the supplemental package was passed, but it will take some time for that aid to get there. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians are suffering under all of this artillery and ballistic missile fire. Some of which is coming from North Korea. So we're seeing something we have not seen before in history, which is North Korean weapons being used in the battlefield that are killing Europeans.
And two of the remaining dictators, the remaining powerful dictators in that part of the world, essentially joining forces and defying Western sanctions.
That's right, they're defying Western sanctions, and Russia has made no secret of its desire to dismantle the entire UN Security Council regime of sanctions, which consists of 11 UN Security Council resolutions, all of which Russia previously had signed up to. Russia is not only defying them themselves, but it wants to try to dismantle those 11 Security Council resolution sanctions as a part of the favor to North Korea for this new military partnership.
Victor Cha, former director for Asian affairs at the White House National Security Council, now a senior vice president for Asia and Korea at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Really good to speak to you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.